Welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hussar Publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. Today's episode is going to be focused on talking about characters and what makes them compelling. I'm Brandon.
I'm Mark, and I'd like to apologise for the use of smoke grenades in Downfall.
So, arguably, the most important thing, more than plot, more than details, more than the cover, more than the title, the thing that I think people remember and focus on the most in any given novel are the characters. Agree or disagree?
I personally agree. I reckon I know a lot of people who disagree. Which I can dive into in a bit more detail later. Personally, though, I agree.
So when you think about characters, there's infinite number of possibilities that come to mind. You could talk about Luke Skywalker and compare him to Rey, no last name given. You can look at Batman and compare him to Superman. You could look at Iron Man, compare him to Captain America. You could look at Cloud Strife and compare him to Clive. There are all sorts of characters that range in all sorts of different spectrums and all sorts of different mediums, and some work great, some don't work at all. And I think the most important thing to start off with is talking about the protagonists. And the way you structure your protagonist, I think, is the most important thing, because when you're writing a novel, and when you're reading a novel, your viewpoint always is going to be through the protagonist's view. And I think from an editorial standpoint, the thing I see the biggest issue with is authors want to write from an omnipotent narrative. An omnipotent narrator. And I myself fell into that same category when I very first started writing, because I didn't necessarily see the importance of writing from point of view, but all of the details that everything that goes into show don't tell can be summarized in a point of view. You know, your main character isn't going to be able to see what the character across the room is doing. Your main character isn't going to be able to see what the villain is doing. They're not going to be able to know the feelings and emotions of any other character. And I think that's what bogs down a novel, is when you focus too much on telling the whole entire thing through a narrator's point of view. And when you write strictly through point of view and you're writing only what the main character in that point of view is seeing and feeling, I feel like it's much more rewarding, wouldn't you say? Yeah,
that's the whole point behind it, and that's something that putting this in British terms, we've got things here, GCSEs and A-levels, exams you do. So you do like English language, English literature, stuff like that. A-levels you do when you're 18, and then you go on to, pre-graduate stuff, degree level stuff. So what I did some university level writing stuff, and this was one of the things which was absolutely hammered home, is what you mentioned about omnipotent narrative. So going with that first is, well, what is omnipotent narrative? It's where where a writer writes about two guys doing a podcast and says, while they're doing the podcast, Brandon says this, but was thinking about this. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, Mark was thinking about it. It's like, stop there. You can't say what Mark was thinking about, because you've already told the reader what Brandon was thinking about, which means you have established Brandon as the point of view character for this. Because otherwise, you're giving too much. The reader doesn't subconsciously feel and think that they're sussing stuff out for themselves. There's no reward. There's no payback for getting stuck into it. So yeah, and that's another risk is, well, so what was Scott Washburn's Kings of War novel? Because I think he did the whole thing, correct me if I'm wrong, from a single point of view, which is high risk. That's maverick writing, because what if your reader doesn't like the point of view character and you've only done one? So that's why most people go for an ensemble cast. So I'm dancing around lots of different ideas here, and I'm sure we can slow down and pick them apart one by one. But the omnipotent narrative is largely avoided, but it's not a felony, it's not a crime. Some people will deliberately do it, but it's considered, I suppose, quite an old school way of telling a story, because it's a very, very, very simple way to get that buy-in from the reader, to make them feel as though they're sussing things out and earning rewards for themselves subconsciously, just by having things through one point of view in each scene. And you can jump to another point of view, that's absolutely fine. But really, by and large, it shouldn't be within the same scene.
The biggest question is, how do you make a character? What goes into it? Do you make them relatable? Do you make them hated? Do you make them likable? There's a question of how to structure your protagonist and how to make them the way that connects in some way. Because the biggest issue is you don't want a character, especially a protagonist, to be unrelatable. You want them to be relatable in some capacity, because you don't want a protagonist to be unrelatable. Then the audience can't connect with what the character is saying and doing. You want them to be some connectability, even with an antagonist-protagonist, if that makes sense. That's kind of...
If I had to put down one word and say, what should a character be? One word, it's flawed. That is the most important thing to me. That's not just as a writer, that's as an audience member. I don't want to see I don't personally relate to and find interest in a character who is absolutely amazing at everything, who has all of the skills in the world, who has no weaknesses, and who everyone within this fictitious world absolutely loves and adores, and everything revolves around them. That's not interesting to me. For me, it's someone who has some real problems, and it's the journey for the character is about overcoming those problems, and maybe they succeed, maybe they fail, but they try, and that's what you relate to, that's what you kind of root for. It's that classic underdog story, I guess. Doesn't necessarily have to be as literal as that, but for me, you mentioned superheroes earlier. I think Spider-Man is a far, far, far more relatable character than Superman.
Yeah, there needs to be aspirations, there need to be goals, there needs to be character development, and so many characters through history do it, right? And so many of them just fall on their sword. I will start off with the controversial topic of saying, I brought up the first two, Luke and Rey Skywalker, and I'm one of those, this is a matter of opinion only, but I am one of those people who grew up watching Episode 4, 5, and 6, and I loved them. And I loved the journey of Luke Skywalker, and I found him such a great character. I remember playing with Luke Skywalker action figures as a kid, and he was my ideal, hero. I really, really enjoyed Star Wars back then. And I found myself really falling out of Star Wars, and it's mostly because of the sequels and how they handled Luke versus Rey. And, it's been said to death about Rey's not Daisy Ridley as an actress, but as Rey Skywalker's handled character, I feel like just was poorly done. And I think it can also be attributed to you had multiple writers and directors working on the movies at the same time. But I just feel like they dishonored Luke by how they handled Rey, and I felt like it was, you had this really strong, powerful character of Luke who goes through hardship and trial, and he goes through a journey where at the beginning he's naive and he's learning, but he lost Obi-Wan, he lost his teacher. Well, that's okay. He thinks he knows what he's doing, and then guess what? The villain's his father, and he loses his hand all in one go, and you just see him struggle. And then when Luke comes back, he's like a much more concentrated, honed person, and it's almost like the story that goes on in between the movies, which is fleshed out in the novels, is left to your interpretation. So there is room that stuff has happened. Even the title crawl, it says stuff has happened in between those two movies that has developed Luke as a character. And when you come back into Return of the Jedi, you see a much more honed, masterful Luke Skywalker with his cloak and his dark gear and everything, and he's a much stronger character. And you see that change between the two movies. But meanwhile, Rey is kind of the same static character throughout the entirety of, she's already a master, she already knows everything, she doesn't need any help, she wards Luke away, and then that character of Luke who never get, even, I was watching something the other day about how many times Mark Hamill tried to warn us about Luke's demise, and he even says, like, this isn't the Luke that you're used to. Luke's character kind of falls, and you have to analyze, why is Luke a compelling character, and what makes Rey not a compelling character?
Yeah, it's target audience, I guess, is a big part of it, and the Disney Star Wars trilogy, divisive, but not a financial disaster, not until the end at least. So there's certainly a huge audience out there of people who love Rey as a character. So there's clearly some success, and there's clearly something there that some people like. I would, again, might be controversial, might not. My guess would be that if you were to look across Star Wars fans and people who are just like ambivalent to Star Wars, that the overwhelming majority of people will prefer Luke as a character to Rey, and it is because of the flaws, and it is because of being able to identify, and it's because of the failures and the struggles and the humility and this is the way that stories have been written for thousands of years. It's the classic hero's journey that's been going on since times of like Homer and things like that. This is not a new way to write a character, and the way George Lucas did it with Luke Skywalker, it's a very time-honoured way. There's a phrase which gets bandied around a lot by internet expert critics is, the self-insert power fantasy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Both of those characters are power fantasies. And I just think it's just one of them is done very well, one isn't.
Characters are tricky, no matter what the setting, no matter what it is, but you have to... your character has to fit the setting. I think that's a big thing. And a lot of people just, it's tough because your character can't, who's to say your character can't be the optimistic, heroic, I'm going to save the world in a desert wasteland of misery? Who's to say that your character can't be the point of somber realism in a world of rainbows and puppy dogs? You have to write. What to you, Mark? What makes a character stand out and compelling? What works and what doesn't work? I mean, you said the hero's journey, which I 100% agree with, because when I was taking college classes about writing, they said the hero's journey is the most powerful, potent thing in writing characters. But what do you think works besides that, and what doesn't work for you?
Flaws, and more flaws. But the thing about the flaws is they have to be realistic, believable, everyday ones for me. Mm-hmm. So you look at yourself, you look at people you look at people you admire and respect, and think, yeah, but no one's perfect. Right. So what is it that this individual struggles with? What do they make mistakes with? And then try and put those in. And no one likes bad-tempered people, but it could be that they have a short temper, but they're still... So they bite people's heads off, but they're quick to apologise after it, and then you say, okay, so there's a more well-rounded individual. It could be that it's someone who is really quiet. It comes across as arrogant, but it's not. It's not arrogant, it's just someone who's introspective. And so a whole load of people dislike them within the book. But it's not fair. So you'll end up rooting for them because underneath all of that, they're genuinely a good person. And again, with what we said with Rey Palpatine as a character, that's someone who absolutely everyone who encounters that character loves, adores her, and their entire kind of reason for being is, what can I do to impress Rey? And I don't find that an endearing quality. Whereas if you get some characters who actually... Look at someone like the classic underdog story like Rocky. Everyone loves Rocky, surely. There's someone who worked really hard, who came from nothing, and who faces adversity, and you're rooting for it. It's the little guy who's come from nothing. So yeah, I think it's the challenge and it's the flaws and it's overcoming obstacles. That's stuff that people relate to. I think it's quite a big difference again between the way Marvel and DC back in the day, back in the kind of pre-Disney takeover era. That's the way they used to do things. I always preferred Marvel characters to DC. And I know that's controversial because DC are hugely successful and people love Superman and Batman and stuff like that, and that's cool. But for me, characters like Spider-Man had flaws and faults and issues to overcome, whereas it's like, what's Bruce Wayne's flaw and fault? Well, he's an orphan. That's not a flaw and fault. That's a reason to be sympathetic to the character. That's something they endured and went through. Where it's like, well, what else you got about the character? He's incredibly good-looking billionaire who's also IQ is off the chart and knows kung fu better than anyone in the world. He's Superman. What's his superpower? Well, everything. And so those two characters to me don't draw me in as much as someone like Spider-Man, who has got all sorts of relatable things going wrong in his life, which I find more endearing, really.
I think we can kind of agree that a character, to be compelling, needs to be relatable in some form, and they need to have flaws that make them relatable. You can make a character hated. You can make your audience hate a protagonist if that's what you're going for, but they have to have that also relatability to be hated. Why are they hated? What is the message you're trying to get? If you want to make a hated protagonist, if you want the audience to go, this guy is a jerk, you got to have the payoff at some point. You got to go on the hero's journey, I think, at some point to make that case. Because if you just have this guy or this person who is just extremely disliked, and they're not nice, they're rude, well, where's the comeuppance? There has to be a comeuppance. You don't want to write a story about this person is an antagonistic person, and that's it. And their whole journey is they're a jerk. That's not a relatable story by any means. I mean, is the world full of jerks? Yes, but even those jerks can find something relatable in a hero story, because in a lot of times, the people who are stuck up and arrogant think they're the hero in their own story. So, a lot of times, people who aren't nice, if they read a story about somebody who's not nice, they're not going to relate to it, because in their eyes, they're a hero in some way or form. So, you have to find relatable traits, and you have to have that character go on a journey, either of redemption, of finding something about themselves. The journey is the most important part of the character that makes them relatable. I think those are the two most important things, relatability and the journey, correct?
Yeah, I'd agree with it. It's interesting getting the feedback on that when you put these relatable traits in, and some of them can be pretty dark, So some of them can be not just simple stuff that all of us go through. You could have real. How do I put it? This will need editing out. You could have some really unenviable character flaws which that character needs to work through. And by the end of it, you do need to have the payoff, which needs to come one of two ways. Either they see the error of their ways and they become a better person, in which case you're following that journey along and going, this is a person who has, it could be racism, sexism, something which is universally accepted as wrong. But by the end of it, one or two things has happened. Either they've seen the error of their ways and become a better person, or they've had their comeuppance and got their just desserts. Or both. And but I've certainly had it when I've tried to go for the darker themes with that, and then you end up with some readers who'll come back and say, I was really uncomfortable by that. And it's like, that's the whole point. That's why I put it there, because it's supposed to be a darker theme to say this character is not a perfect person. They've got some real bad parts to their character. But you will still get a small number of readers will say, okay, so the character feels that way, ergo the author does. I say, well, no. I mean, for all of us in the writing within the wargaming side of things, we write about people killing other people. It doesn't mean that all of us have killed other people. It's like it's a work of fiction, and it will have darkness in it. But I think it's really important for a well-rounded character that you do need to have these flaws, but it doesn't mean that the author endorses those flaws, as obvious as that sounds. And I think most people get that.
But yeah, no, you bring up a very great point, and that's something that I think more readers need to really understand, is that the characters are created by an author, yes, but that doesn't mean that the author sympathizes or agrees with any of the points. I mean, that's like saying, well, the author made this bad guy who did a really bad thing, so clearly he supports the bad guy. No, just because an author makes characters does not mean he stands by the viewpoints of any of the characters. That's why it's fiction. Everybody should have flaws. So just because you create a sexist character does not mean that you're a sexist. Just because the sexist character has a good ending does not mean you support sexism. But that's that character's flaw to work on. And a lot of times that sexist character will have a moment of, oh, I need to change my ways. And just because it's not the focus of the novel at that point does not mean that it's being supported by the author. That's something that really I think readers should take away. I think we've entered this age of new age. Even when I was in college, there was classes I took that were focused on criticism and overthinking of what the author meant. And I don't think that every single piece of fiction needs to be hyper analyzed and looked at what is the author trying to support. I think that a story should be read as a good story without an over analyzation of what the author is trying to do. Characters in these works that we publish are characters, and they don't necessarily I don't think any of them represent the views of the authors. We've brought him up a few times. Ben Stoddard with his book Drowned Secrets. His character was a very morally gray character who made questionable decisions, and some of them paid off, some of them didn't. But does that mean Ben's a morally gray person? No, Ben's a very upstanding individual who I've had the pleasure of knowing over these years, but I didn't once think, just because his character murders a zombie person does not mean that Ben supports murder. No, I don't think that one does not correlate to the other at all.
Yeah, my favourite of all, we mentioned comic books a bit, and when I used to be into them a lot more, I used to love reading Punisher comics, and I loved that character, and that is a dark character. That is darker than anything I have ever written, and I love that character, but that doesn't mean I support the vigilante movement or idea. It means it's a work of fiction. Even taking a step back from that, I mentioned at the start of this, whether it survives the edit or not, about over here in the UK, A-levels. And when I did A-level, which is the exams you do when you're 18, I did English literature. And when we were analysing any existing piece of work, we were told for this exam that you analyse things on plot, character and theme. And that was the framework you analysed something on. So it's like, okay, so what are we talking about? Well, character is character. That's what we've been talking about here for the past 20 minutes or so. Now, when we get to plot or theme, you'd look at plot. So Tarantino movies classically have very dynamic, flowing, convoluted, or in times, plots. Really complex stuff. Whereas theme, you look at something really thematic, like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings makes a lot of commentary on the potential evils of industrialization. It talks a lot about World War One in places. And what the author went through on the front lines in World War One. So you see that thematic stuff. It's not as direct. It's not as in your face. It's not on the nose, but it's there.
Right.
And I think if you were to analyse what is an author trying to say, that's more getting into theme, not character.
Right.
So it can be. So what would be another theme? Starship Troopers, not the movie, the book. There's a lot of theme in that book, an awful lot of theme. There's themes like that you should only vote if you're a citizen, and you can only be a citizen if you've done military service. Ergo, in that world, you have to have done military service to be allowed to vote, and that's a pretty right-wing theme. So the author has classically been judged on that quite a lot. But if you were to look at the characters of any of these, for me personally, I think having a character do something, that would be like having a go at George Lucas for the actions of Emperor Palpatine. It's like he made a bad guy. It's like, that's the whole point. Right.
And you know what? I want to give an example before we switch gears into antagonists and other party members. And I want to talk about an example of a character that didn't work in our writing. Most of our characters that we publish, the novels that we publish, all, I think, follow these rules of having a journey and having flaws. Those are things that I really look for, and I try to work with the authors to not have characters who are good at everything and they don't have any challenge. You know, there's got to be a way for the characters to develop. And some authors do it better than other authors. Some are very more pronounced with the developments, and some are kind of let it on the sidelines. And when you write sequels and everything, that you have to have that flow in there too, a new challenge for the character. But one example of that didn't work, that I had to have the author rewrite, there was a novel that we were working on, and I was struggling with the character because the author continuously had everybody enamored by the protagonist, and he was the most polite person, and it was almost without question he was accepted by everyone. And I told him that he needed to put in some more challenges for the protagonist to encounter to, make them more relatable. So the author then put in on the second draft a fire that was happening, and the protagonist had to go and save the people in the fire. And then he was the hero in that situation too. And I said to him, we need to stop having the protagonist come to conclusions like that. He needs to actually be challenged more. If he's going to go in a fire, he has to come out with some injury then. And even if it's a light scarring or something that affects him moving forward, even if it's something that's niggling in the background for a little bit and then goes away, it needs to be something that happens to give development. One of the examples that I can come up with is in my novel, Rebirth of Courage. I've been constantly trying to seed in areas of the party has had an encounter, a fighting encounter of some sort. Not everybody's going to escape every single time perfect. But that said, not everybody's going to wind up with a broken arm, broken leg every single time. So I've been trying to add in little things like, he hurt his ankle, so he needs to be careful, embrace it moving forward, and maybe in the next fight, he's tender on his ankle. Oh, he got a couple scratches on his arm, so maybe his arm's a little tender. Those are the things you want to keep flowing, so that way characters are relatable and not God-killing machines. And that's actually something that Mark has helped me with when he was going through the revisions with me, is that, you want to put in these flaws, so that way the fights don't want to be premeditated. You don't want to go into a battle scene and know, well, everybody's been scot-free so far. Even though I'm a type of person who I don't like to use death so commonly as some other more modern authors, I still want there to be that hesitation in readers' minds when they're reading it, saying, ooh, is this going to be a fight where something's going to happen? Is everybody going to be okay? What's the extent of the injuries? I don't want it to be necessarily, everything's going to be fine. It's just a showcase of weapons, and that's it. That's not compelling. That doesn't tell a good story. I think, Mark, you said when you first read the very first draft, it was you glanced over fights because it was so predictable. You want to add that element of unpredictability into fights to make it more compelling to read.
Yeah, it's trying to strike a balance for me, and all of this stuff, everything we're talking about here, it's all personal preference. I don't think there's any wrong answer.
Right.
It's all personal preference. So I've said earlier, Superman and Batman don't grip me as much. I still love them as characters.
Right.
They're just not top of the tree for me. I still think they're great. Just by they're still great characters, and they're timeless characters that'll be with us forever. They're awesome. Right, striking the balance, fight scenes, power levels, all that sort of stuff. Really, that really ties in as well for when you're writing stuff which is within IPs, within wargame fiction. That really matters. So, what is striking the balance? Well, for me, One side of the spectrum would be that you have no fear at any point for the character you are rooting through to make it through to the end, because every single encounter they face, there's never any hardship. They never get a scratch. They never get knocked down. They just plough through everything without even flinching. Then you're not really worrying about them. You're not as emotionally invested in them. That would be one side.
Right.
The other side for me would be, again, Game of Thrones, hugely, hugely successful, and I'm not knocking it in any way. It's better than anything I could ever do. I get that, but it's not for me. It's a personal preference thing. It's not for me because everybody dies in it. There's no point in emotionally investing in anyone because you know there's a very good chance they're going to die, and they're going to die horribly. So,
exactly.
So for me, that doesn't draw me in. For me, it's got to be something in the middle, which I appreciate is rich because I've written books for Winged Hussar where no one dies and everyone gets through to the end. And I think there is a time for that, but certainly they took the book I'm thinking of in particular at the moment. Those characters took big hits along the way. They needed help along the way. They had major injuries along the way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what it is, and it's down to the individual author and for the reader to know what they like and don't like. There's a sliding scale between just having a absolute powerhouse of a character who is never ever challenged to a bloodbath where no one survives and everything in between. And yeah, it's about getting that balance right, I think.
And with our work, we have compelling characters in the sense of you can read Steps to Deliverance, where you have Orion, a powerful character who is conflicted, and then you can also read Ascent of the Goblin King, which is about a antagonistic goblin who is the protagonist in this sense, who still has goals and aspirations, and you cheer for them. We have a range, I think, that we do well of characters who are compelling in different shades of gray, and different authors do different shades well, and I think that's a good thing about our publishing house and about our novels that we tell, is that we tell stories about compelling characters at the end of the day. That is, whether it's in wargaming or whether it's in standalone fiction, I always stand by how strong our characters are. And I really am a believer in making sure that happens before the novels go to print.
Yeah, that plot character theme thing. Different authors go for different things. For me, I'm not clever enough to come out with thematic stuff. I don't have sweeping world views, I want to say, like Tolkien did, saying, the guy survives World War One. Most of his friends are killed. He sees horrors that the majority of the human race will never have seen. And he's got things to say. And that's incredible. And that's laudable. I'm not that guy. I don't put thematic stuff. I don't. Plot, again, some people do some really, really clever plot twists and turns. That's not what I want to write. That's not what I enjoy. I want a real simple plot, which is there purely as a vehicle for the readers to get to know the characters far, far better. And for me, 95% of the effort and the prep of any novel I write will go into the characters. That's what drags me in. But it's different things with different people. Some people might do absolutely paper-thin characters because there isn't time to get to know them because the plot is so complex. And that works too. That's just a different way of doing it.
Right. Before we shift gears a little bit and change to some other antagonists and party members and other topics, I just want to shout out today's sponsor, On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. So we've talked about protagonists pretty much this whole show, but there's more to a cast of characters than that. I mean, the protagonists are the central point of any novel, and it's evident that we spent a bunch of time talking about them because of how central they are. But the antagonists, I argue, are almost just as important, as well as the surrounding cast. And then, in addition to that, I want to pose a question to talk about in a little bit of, character death and shock. Let's talk about that in a little bit. But let's start off with antagonists. Difference between a good antagonist and a bad antagonist is motive and, relatability as well. The difficult thing and I think television and movie have kind of spurred at least my generation to think this way, is you don't want to make the bad guy bad just for the sake of having an antagonist. You don't want to make villains a mustache twirling antagonist who just, I want to kill everybody because I want to kill everybody. I want to ruin the world because I don't like happy. A real good antagonist has to have relatability just as much as the protagonist does. I think you really hit the nail on the head in Steps to Deliverance, and I think that's the thing that people talk the most about in that novel is the character of Dion and how he was this community hero that fell to darkness, and he was a person everybody respected and loved, but the darkness was more powerful than anything. The sway of power and what that commanded to save his people outweighed his heroics, and that made for a compelling character.
Yeah, I said in the last episode, was it the last episode? We've been here a long time, haven't we? I've been trapped in this room. Yeah, with so just talk, man, talk about stuff. I think it was the last episode where I said Steps to Deliverance is, if I could go back and do it again, I'd do it differently. And
yes,
Dion's fall from light to dark was too quick. I think I could do that better with a bit more experience now. But you've only got so. That's not the story. The story was ultimately, it's kind of Orion's story, really. It wasn't supposed to be. He was supposed to be the secondary character. It was supposed to be Tancred's story, but Orion's cooler and better looking. So yeah, Dion. That was a really, really simple and old-fashioned way of writing a antagonist, which is exactly what you said, which is one way, not the only way, one way within the writer's textbook, if you will, of writing an antagonist is to make them believe they're doing the right thing. And again, even if you look at, I keep harking back to Star Wars, Palpatine, he's there saying once his evil plan, which he does a good evil laugh, it's brilliant, but he says there will be peace and order in the galaxy. That's his ultimate aim, and it's really evil the way he goes about it, but he thinks he's the good guy. That's a pretty time-honoured way of writing a decent bad guy, is to have them think that what they're doing is right and that they're the person who has to make the hard choices which no one else is willing to do to get to the good end state. So that's what I tried to do with that character. I think, again, with the benefit of a few years more experience now, it was clunky in places. It could be better, but I think you've always got to go back and review your own stuff and see that. I've ripped on DC. Look at the Joker as a bad guy. There's an absolutely fantastically crafted bad guy. Well, depending on which version, there's been so many, but that isn't a bad guy who thinks they're doing the right thing. So there's other ways of doing it. It's like, here's someone who is fundamentally evil and cackling and stuff, but is just so well done. I think in terms of, well, which would be my favourite version of it, probably the Michael Keaton Batman. So Jack Nicholson's version was just amazing, and that's the charisma of the actor, I suppose, in a lot of ways. But yeah, there's different ways of doing it. Is what I'm trying to get to in a very long and rambly way.
No, you're right, but there's also, villains. Antagonists should be done in one of two ways, I think. I think that you really need to have an antithesis to the protagonist. So you want to have somebody who is completely different to the protagonist. So that way they feed off each other. Or you want to have the antagonist have followed in the protagonist's steps, but they're 2 steps away. They were similar to the protagonist in some point, and then something happened to change them. And this is the path that protagonists could go down if they followed the similar path. I think those are 2 of the most compelling antagonists to me.
Yeah, we always want to avoid having the bad guy say, "We're not so different, you and I." But I've done it. I've done it, and again, Steps to Deliverance gets mentioned a lot. I've written other stuff, I promise, but there's a goodie and a baddie in Steps to Deliverance who have very, very similar backstories. And as the baddie says to the goodie, words to the effect of you're one bad day away from becoming me. And it's a trope. It is definitely a trope. Even maybe a cliche, which I think is what's the difference for me? A cliche is when a trope goes bad. And there are some cliches in my writing. I'm not immune to them. But I think bad guys can be written that way. It can work. Sometimes there is, particularly in a high fantasy setting, there is some benefit in just having someone who's just evil. There's something satisfying about seeing them lose when you want a kind of uplifting end to the story. So yeah, there's definitely different ways of doing it.
So yeah, I mean, the antagonists are just as important to any novel as the protagonists are, but also so are the supporting cast. And whether you have a big cast, a small cast, I think you need to have some cast that supports the main character. And, that's an episode that we have planned. Maybe the next one or the one after that, but we're going to be talking about supporting cast. But you need to have people that the main character can bounce off of. It depends also on your main character's traits. If you've got the dark, brooding main character, you want him to have somebody lighthearted and talkative to bounce off of, so that way your main character doesn't have to speak as much, and he can think in narration, and the supporting character can talk. If you've got a character who's upbeat and talkative, you want to have somebody who's a little bit more stoic to bounce off of. And while it helps to have two characters who can talk to each other and have that repertoire, that's what a diversity in cast helps with. It helps to create that dynamic. And I think that's something a lot of authors struggle with, is that they're so hyper-focused on writing and narration that they forget that dialogue has such an important plot in developing the characters. Everybody wants to move the plot along, but the plot can be moved along while still taking time out to just have characters talk for a little bit. Honestly, one of my favorite parts in any RPG, and this is done so well in Dragon Age, and just recently as I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3, when the characters are walking around the world and they have banter with each other, my heart kind of melts, because I'm like, oh, here is two characters I enjoy. And, in that case, you are almost a silent protagonist. You have choices that you can say, but you don't have vocal options. You have choices. And this is a case of you're already making all the choices throughout, but now your characters get to have some say. And that helps to add to them and add to how you see them, because, in a lot of these games, and even in a lot of stories, the characters, the supporting cast interacts with the main character primarily. That's the main vessel for telling the story. But when you have characters talking amongst each other that aren't the protagonist, I think that also helps make them compelling in 3D, because you can see how two other characters of two completely different ideologies and thoughts are interacting with each other. I think that's cool.
I'm kind of going into a bit of a tangent, because this is sort of more video game stuff, I guess, but still very characters. But for me, Dragon Age Origins was a masterclass in storytelling because of what it did with characters. It's probably been done a million times since then, but I had never seen it done before, where you're wandering around in a relatively open world, and depending on which characters you choose from your supply of people to back you up, they may have a perfectly pleasant conversation behind you as you're wandering around, or they could be at each other's throats, and depending on which two you picked. And that was a brilliant way of adding this really dynamic real world feel to these people, which I thought was done really well. Taking a step back from that and back into characters versus the plot side of it, if I had to pick my favourite novel of all time, it's a novel called Piece of Cake by Derek Robinson, which is about a fighter squadron in the first year of World War II. And there is no plot. The plot's absent. The book starts on the minute, basically about the hour that World War II is declared, and it ends 365 days later in the middle of a combat scene, which you don't know how it ends because a year has elapsed. And all it does is tell you the stories of this cast of characters, these 12 fighter pilots who die and are replaced, who die and are replaced, and you jump from person to person, and you don't really get to know that much about them because it's so fleeting, because they're killed off so quickly, because tragically that's what the mortality rate was. And they're also really well balanced because they have flaws. They're not all square-jawed heroes. Some of them are bad people who have got a hard job to do and do the job well. But it's about, so much of that book is not about combat, it's not about plot. It's just about conversations at a bar between people. And that's what the book is about. And it is so well done. It is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, at the core of it, when you're reading a novel versus reading a textbook, it's a fundamental difference. When you're reading a textbook, you are reading facts. When you are reading a novel, you are being put in the shoes of the protagonist. That's the whole point of the point of view. And I think that you need to have that relatability, again, as we've been saying, that relatability to have the person reading the book interested in the stories. And I think, circle back a little bit, I think any author who's looking to try to up their game on characters and making them defined, unique, and fleshed out should either play Dragon Age Origins, it's cheap and runs on any computer on Steam, or watch playthroughs on YouTube, watch the character videos, because honestly, like Mark said, I think that out of all the RPGs I've played, they have done character development and characterization the best, and they have a cast of compelling characters that years later, I can't even tell you how many years it's been, at least a decade, I still harken back to that game and look at how they did characters and plot and everything and think of it, it's a masterclass in writing. So I think any aspiring authors listening to this, you should at least go check out Dragon Age Origins on Steam. If you have any type of working laptop, it should work fine. You can put the settings on low. I don't think you'll be disappointed with the way the characters are structured and the way the game plays to your strengths of character.
Yeah, it is so well done. And for me, kind of writing in fantasy settings, when I stop and think about it, I took a lot from that. It was so well done. It was. I think it was in an era as well, because it is quite an old game where computer games, video games didn't have the respect and credibility that they do now. Sounds like a really pretentious thing to say, but as an art form, I guess.
You're right.
And but it was absolutely fantastic storytelling, but character-driven storytelling. I get snippets of feedback about the stuff I write, and I think for someone who wants to write characters, I entered this industry naively thinking that people would love my characters and talk about my characters, and that's not going to happen. You've got to really hit it out of the park in a kind of Sherlock Holmes level of here's a character for all time level to really get to that. But when people have come back and said, with I think it's more with the Kings of War side of things, fight scenes nice, very well done and all that, replicate the game, lovely, but I wanted to skip through that because what I wanted to get to was the bit where I see how the characters interact with each other in these bits between the fights. And for me, I think I've subconsciously taken that from Dragon Age Origin, because all I was doing was desperately trying to get through the fights, which I wasn't very interested in, to get more to the character development and interaction that goes on in between them in Dragon Age Origin, which is so well done.
Before we wrap up, one of the last things I want to talk about today is mortality. We read these books, at least I do, and I think a majority of readers do, to enter a world of fantasy. Doesn't matter the setting, whether it's a fantasy genre, sci-fi, real world, romance, horror. We want to enter a world that is different than our own. And I think one of my personal issues that I have, and you brought it up earlier, Mark, is death. Shows and books like Game of Thrones and Walking Dead are fantastically written and fantastically portrayed, and I cannot say enough good about them on the one hand, but when the television shows for both of those things came out, they happened at the same time, and I think I suffered from mortality overload, because both of those shows deal heavily with don't get invested in these characters because they're all going to die. And I remember just week after week watching both of them being like, oh my God, they're killing everyone. I'm like, why am I watching these shows? I don't feel any bit excited. I just get disappointed because everybody dies and the antagonists don't have their comeuppance yet. It's still not going to come up for another few seasons. And when they do, it's lackluster. So I really, I've always been of the mind frame of we have enough dark fantasy. Let's bring some high fantasy and some hopefulness back to the genre. But it happened to me even more when I was watching that, and I'm just like, we're doing death too much nowadays. And I think, and I understand there's a relatability to that. And I understand that, we are mortals and life is precious. And that's part of what a lot of the authors are working towards is, life is precious. Don't take things for granted and learn from the sacrifice of others. But it gets to a point where it's like, you can read these in any novel and you can look at a scene a character dies in. And I'm not talking about just Winged Hussar novels. I'm talking about any novels. You look at a scene a character dies in and you can rework it and go, what would have been different if this character lived? What would have been different if this character was just written out instead of dying? That's a big thing I try to stress to authors, and something we worked with in the early days of Wild West Exodus. The lore master of that said he wanted to kill off one of the characters. Historically, there were the Younger brothers, and I think it was Cole Younger who he wanted to kill off in the Jesse James trilogy. And it wasn't even at like a climax point. It was just during the last battle he wanted to kill off Cole Younger. That's fine. It was his story. We did it. Well, then in the anthology we did for that, he said, okay, well, I want him to focus on the Younger brothers. I'm like, okay. And he says, all right, well, Cole Younger is blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, whoa. He's dead. You killed him in the last book. He goes, well, find a way to bring him back to life. And I'm like, we could have avoided this whole thing if we just wrote the character out instead of killing him. It's that point of how much shock value do you really need in writing? How much purpose does the death serve that is quote unquote necessary where you can go another route? In my standalone series, I have characters that are dead pre-coming into the book, but they died for different reasons, and it didn't happen on screen. I don't have any main characters or supporting characters die mid-text because I don't see a point in it. It doesn't serve a purpose to me. Other authors... there was that. I forget if it was you, Mark, or somebody else I was working with that I said, let's not kill this character. Let's write them out because we can bring them back another point. And we didn't kill the character. There's ways to go about it. And I think that I just personally am of the belief that death is too overdone in novels.
Yeah, as well as it being overdone in storytelling now, there's also how final should it be? One of the big writers, I think it was a Marvel writer, only in the last couple of weeks said that death is undone so much in the MCU that it doesn't really matter anymore. It used to be if a character dies on screen or they die in a graphic novel, whatever it might be, that it really hits you hard. Whereas now it's all right. They'll be back in 6 months because death is meaningless, and so that's the one side to it. Death should be feared. It's a powerful tool in an author's toolbox. But on the other side of it, if everyone is just dropping dead, there's no emotional investment, and also it ceases to have its impact. So I think it's to be used sparingly, and I got to admit, I'm very much of the same mindset as your good self, in that for me, stories can have a dark ending, a sinister ending, tonally, but ultimately, I kind of want an overall elements of a happy ending. I mean, what have we done together recently? We did Faith Aligned and Hero Falling. So Faith Aligned. Well, the bad guys win, without putting too finer a point on it. The bad guys win. But the majority of the protagonists, they survive. and they survive as better people, as stronger people, and having achieved something, and with hope ahead of them. Hero Falling, again, spoilers, skip if you intend to buy it and read it, but Hero Falling, they all survive. But there's the kind of despair and the hopelessness that, again, in that, the baddies win. The big evil that they went to stop, they're too late. They don't stop it. And the main character, the heroine, she doesn't get the guy. It doesn't end the way that it should have done because of her stubbornness. And so yeah, I tried to do all of that to say, well, here's some uplifting parts of it, but balanced. But there's not much death. There's not much, oh yeah, and this person dies, and this person dies, and this person dies, because it closes a lot of doors for you. It's overdone, and it's to be used sparingly if you want it to have impact.
Yeah, I mean, you can end a novel with the bad guys winning and still have it have impact of hope. I mean, it's the quintessential example of Empire Strikes Back. Bad guys win. Luke loses his hand. They lost Han. Everything ended poorly. But there's still that scene at the end where Luke and Leia and C-3PO and R2-D2 are in the medical bay and they're just staring out into space, and there's that sense of hope that it's not over yet. And I think that we should focus more on that. If you want dark, then have the bad guys win, but let there be a sense of hope. You know, I don't see. I think the best example of how death has become mainstream is, I think you hit it on the head with the Marvel. Jean Grey has died and come back to life so many times. So many times. And when a character does die in Marvel, it's so rare that they stay dead. But the few examples of when they do stay dead are just terrible, because there's always characters I like. And I'm like, why are you killing that character? Like, what was the point of that? Write them out. Don't use them for a while. Why kill them? Why? You know, you reach that example of, if they're dead, what are the overlasting effects? You can't use them because they're dead unless you cheat death. I actually just recently went in this example, and I'll give a little bit of a background information for a future novel I'm writing down the line. One of the later Dragoon Clan novels that I'm working on, again, I have this whole entire series planned out, but one of the later novels, I had planned for a character to die and come back to life. And in looking at it years later, I said to myself, well, why is this character going to die? What's the point of them dying? Especially if they're going to come back to life. It doesn't serve a point. So instead, I tweaked that to be something different, where that character just becomes inaccessible for a while, but they're still alive, quote unquote. And it gets resolved later on. But you have to look at why you were killing somebody, and does the plot serve a purpose without it? Can you continue the novel without it? Can you continue the plot line without it? Why do it then?
Yeah, if you do this another bit of a trope, this classic phoenix rising from the ashes, it can be done quite well, I think. If you kill a hero in a setting where you say that it's something they have to go through to come back stronger, better able to combat evil, whatever it might be. It can be done well, but again, I keep saying the same thing again and again here. Sparingly. It's to be done sparingly, otherwise it just loses its impact.
I agree. And one last thing I want to touch on, because we didn't really fully touch on it, I do want to explore it just briefly. Tropes. Character tropes are no longer character tropes. So the things that we've always called character tropes aren't even tropes anymore, because of the fact that everybody is trying to put a spin on the trope. Again, there is no such thing as originality anymore. If you think about a concept, it's been done. Even things I've come up with for Dragoon Clan, like just ideas I have for novels, they've been done in some capacity since the time I've come up with the original idea. Like, I play games, I watch shows, I'm like, they did that. That is exactly what I had in mind, and I had to tweak the idea a little bit so it doesn't base off of a copyrighted claim of some sort. Even though an idea cannot be copyrighted, I don't want to bounce off of another already existing franchise. Then somebody go, oh, it was already done and blah, blah, blah. It's impossible to have originality. So I think that we've leaned so far out of using tropes, the misguided tropes are now the tropes. There's always, originally it was like the bard, and now you've gone so far out of the useless bard that you now have. The useless bard is really an assassin. That those two classes have kind of become intermingled in like D&D sense. You know, a lot of times you can put the bard and the assassin in the same category because they become one class. We've strayed from the useless, like, weak bard because people don't want to see that as a character anymore. So that's not really the trope anymore. You put a bard that follows the party and sings about their exploits. It's not necessarily a new trope, or it's not necessarily a trope because it's so less used. I think I haven't seen The Witcher, so correct me if I'm wrong if you've seen it, Mark. But Jasper, is that the name of the bard?
Oh, I don't know. I got into Witcher 3, I played into it a little bit. It was cool, but it wasn't for me, so I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the Netflix stuff.
Well, I'm gonna make a few assumptions here, and our listeners can correct me if I'm wrong. But from what I've seen, Jasper is kind of like the bard that follows the party or follows Geralt around. Geralt. If I'm pronouncing it again, I apologize. I have not seen any of The Witcher. I know. Shoot me with your flaming arrows. I apologize. But he follows the main character around. And he's kind of like, from what I've seen of the teasers, he's an actual bard. And you don't see it too much anymore. And that might be why they went with that route, is because it is not a trope anymore. It's fallen out of use. Again, more commonly than not, in any video game, any movie I see, if you have a bard in the group, they're an assassin as well. They're not just skilled at playing the lute. They've also got these daggers up their sleeve, and they're going to murder somebody. So I think that the word trope needs to be... I think people need to stop focusing on critique on tropes, because I think tropes can be helpful, especially when everything has been done. You need to lean on something that you can find tried and true. There are certain character personalities that when I see authors write, I'm like, oh, I can relate, I can understand where that character fits into the flow. You know, I personally, and this is something, again, we'll talk about in the character party video, my perfect composition, especially when I'm playing games or when I'm reading or writing, whatever, I like a main character, I like a love interest, I like the sarcastic best friend or the stoic best friend, or you put them both in there and you have the sarcasm in one character and the stoicism in the other character, and I think you have a well-rounded, relatable party. Whether it's been done to death or not, I find enjoyment in that.
Yeah, being done to death for me, there's a reason stuff gets done to death. It's because it's successful and it's good. So over here on my side of the channel, there's a author called Bernard Cornwell who you may have heard of. Sean Bean. He dies in everything on TV. But over on this side, he was kind of propelled into fame. One of the things he did early in his career was a character called Richard Sharp, who was a officer in the British Army in the Napoleonic era.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, so the books. One of the criticisms which has gone towards those books, which are phenomenally successful, and from a historical point of view, they are amazing. Is that they're all the same. That every single one, it's okay, so what happens in this book in Sharp? Well, Sharp, who's come up through the ranks, he's an ex-ranker, not a real officer. He ends up having an argument with a real officer who's actually not a nice person at all, bit of a coward, more money than sense, bought his rank. Then there'll be some probably relatively upper-class girl who'll fall in love with Sharp. He'll get the girl, he'll lose at something to the bad guy officer, he'll then get his comeuppance later on and probably beat Seven Shades out of him, and then every second book he'll get promoted. And they're all the same. And it doesn't. And from my point of view, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they're all the same because they're all fantastic. So sometimes familiarity can be a great thing. And Bernard Cornwell's gone on to write other stuff. He's written Sharp in Agincourt. He's written Sharp in all sorts of settings, and he's given him a different name, but it's still Sharp, and it's still the same formula, and it's still excellent. And I still love them. I still think they're great. And you don't always need to have your expectations subverted. That stupid phrase which gets banded around. Yeah, cool. Having something really original and groundbreaking, if it can be done, that's great. But for people who rip into traditional storytelling, I don't. I think old-fashioned ways of telling stories can be really well done. And Bernard Cornwell is perhaps the best example I can think of as to someone who does tell that traditional story, but but does it really well every time and never disappoints. And yeah, you said about original characters and not. I mean, I look at what I've written with Winged Hussar, and it's basically the same story. There isn't a lot of variation in what I write, and that's not deliberate. That's just, I guess, the story I like to tell. And there are some. If you were to look at Steps to Deliverance versus Downfall, or Steps to Deliverance in Space, as I'd call it, there are a lot of similarities. Although, again, the characters aren't original. Orion is basically MCU's Thor. He's the guy who got too big for his boots, who the massive gargantuan chisel-jawed good-looking hero who has a moment where he then goes, "No, I need to be a better person."
Now, does that mean that in the next Orion book we can look forward to him sitting on the couch, playing Call of Duty, getting a beer gut and eating pizza? Possibly.
I'm not sure about the mullet. I'm not sure I'd go as far as that. And likewise, with Downfall, Hawkins probably owes a lot to Luke Skywalker, just this naive, stupid, really well-meaning bit of an idiot who's amazingly good with a laser sword. So there's these. I'm not doing anything original with what I write, and I'm at peace with that, because I'm kind of happy with old-fashioned storytelling and leaning on people who've done it better than me.
So to sum up what we've kind of said here today, I think we can agree that protagonists need to go on a journey and need to be relatable in some form. Antagonists need to be relatable also, and can be tied directly in with the protagonist in some way, whether they are a bounce off, or they're the complete opposite of that character, whether they are similar to the character and they went in a different direction. They need to be relatable as well, and a good antagonist doesn't just plot world destruction with no other objectives. Character death, I think the consensus here is we kind of think it's overdone a little bit. Make your own decisions about that one. If you like more grounded in reality fiction, that's your own belief. But I think we kind of want to try to see a rising of high fantasy again and lightheartedness. Anything else you want to throw in, Mark? Any other comments on that?
Yeah, character as a vehicle to drive a novel forwards, for me, is the most interesting way of doing it. It's not the only way, but it's the way I like both to write and to read. But also backing up what you've said about the lighter side of storytelling. And when you're writing about conflict, it's not necessarily going to be full light, as in rom-com light, but it can have an uplifting ending. And it's like, well, what's the point in the story? The story's there to entertain, and it is a valid technique of entertaining someone is to have them leave a cinema, switch off a computer game, or close the final page on a book and feel better than when they started, and to have it have some hope and some optimism and some happiness. And it seems to have fallen out of favour and out of fashion a bit recently across some areas of the entertainment industry. But I still think there's a place for it, and it's certainly what I enjoy.
Most people read fantasy to get away from reality, so we need to bring back the fantasy into fantasy. And also, I am now going to push for a retelling of Steps to Deliverance done in a bard's perspective as a rom-com.
Can you, if you can get someone to do that in fact, can I pick from the cast of WHP authors? Because I'm not going to write it. It'd be funnier if someone else did it.
Absolutely. I think it would be great to have some fan write it. Just somebody in the Kings of War form be like, Ryan just strode up on his horse, fell off, stood up, put a hand through his hair and said, "Hey, how's it going?"
It would. Going back a long time, I did write for some. One of the novels I've written relatively recently for Winged Hussar I've been lucky enough to have my first example of fan fiction appearing on the internet, and it is
yes.
It's absolutely fascinating to me to see someone else write my characters and and in some ways absolutely nail them, in some ways very much not, and just go, no, that's not quite right. But it doesn't matter, because even though it's very tongue-in-cheek and it's very silly, I enjoyed every minute of it and thought it was really well put together, because it was even kind of poking holes and making fun out of the way I write and the words I overuse, and that was masterfully done. You've got to be able to laugh at yourself. And yeah, it was funny.
Orion happens to be a big business entrepreneur who went to high school with Estelle, who's just a small town girl who used to live in the city, but now she's coming back to her small town, and the two of them meet and get together. Coming to Hallmark Channel this holiday season, it's Steps to Deliverance.
I'd watch it.
And on that note, thanks for listening. I've been Brandon Rossbaum.
I'm Mark Barber.
And we'll see you in the next episode.